Then the Lord God said, "It is not good for man to be alone. I shall make a suitable helpmate for him." Genesis 2:18. Let's be honest, that verse doesn't really jive with our 21st century way of thinking, does it? And many Christians look at this verse and don't know what it means, and it makes them uncomfortable, so they simply avoid it or pretend that it doesn't exist. In our culture, if a woman is a helpmate, it's almost a demeaning role that places her below her husband. But I think that's because we have the wrong understanding, the wrong definition of helpmate. So what I want to do in this video is dive into Genesis 2:18 and see what this word helpmate actually means and how it applies to our life. So let's jump in. We're going to start by looking at what helpmate doesn't mean. Unfortunately, this passage and this term helpmate has been used and abused by people for a long time. So before we get into what it means, I want to deal with some of these misconceptions that are unfortunately very common in today's culture. So let's look at 4 things that helpmate doesn't mean. The first misconception is that helpmate is a term of inferiority. Many of us, when we view this word, when we hear it, we think of it as a status. That Adam is somehow elevated over Eve because she is just a helpmate. But we shouldn't forget, just a chapter earlier, when God created Adam and Eve, they were both made in his image. And when God created Eve and called her Adam's helpmate, there was no implication of inferiority or that she would be subject to him. In God's original plan, Adam and Eve were different, but equal. Being a helpmate doesn't infer inferiority. Adam and Eve might have had different strengths and weaknesses, but they were really 2 pieces of a whole, not one being better than the other, just different. Helpmate is not a term of inferiority. The second misconception of helpmate is that wives are servants to their husbands. And this is really an egregious view that unfortunately has been common for much of human history, and that is that wives exist to do their husband's bidding. But that is not at all what this word helpmate means. Wives aren't servants to their husbands, they're co-laborers with their husbands. And sadly, many Christian marriages have been held back because the husband views the wife simply as his servant, but that's not what this word or this verse means. The third misconception is that women can never lead. God designed women to do so much more than just play a supporting role within their home, and the Bible is full of stories of women who did just that, who led within their home and led outside of their home and did incredible things for God's kingdom. And too often the church, too often Christians hold women back from reaching their full potential because we've looked at this term helpmate and we've misapplied what it actually means. Now that we've dealt with some of the misconceptions about what helpmate doesn't mean, let's look at what it actually means. And we're going to start by looking at what this word originally meant and how we've translated it and missed some of the depth and beauty of this word, helpmate. Genesis 2:18 was originally written in Hebrew, and it's important that we recognize that it was originally written in another language and translated into English. And sometimes what can happen when we translate words, particularly from an ancient language to a modern language, is sometimes the translations, there isn't a one-for-one. So we have to kind of choose the word that best fits. And particularly when we're looking at a word like helpmate, it helps us to understand what the original word was and what it meant so that we can understand how this word applies to our life. Now, you'll have to forgive me because I'm probably going to butcher these words, but the original word that was in Hebrew for helpmate was Ezer Kenegdo. Really, this isn't even a single word. It's 2 words that we've kind of put together. And so we're going to break down both of these words to see what it really means. And we're going to start with Kenegdo because that one's pretty straightforward. It's easy to understand. It simply means opposite or counterpart. In other words, in the context of this passage, what that is saying is that Eve was opposite or a counterpart to Adam. And again, this doesn't mean that she was inferior, just different. You can be different from somebody, but still be equal to. And that's what Genesis 2:18 is trying to communicate, that Eve was opposite or counterpart to Adam. Now, Ezer is a notoriously difficult word to translate. Most English translations simply just say a helper suitable or a helpmate or a helpmeet, but those don't really encapsulate the idea of what Ezer actually meant in the Hebrew language. A more literal translation of Ezer would be to be strong, to rescue, to save. And this word is actually used 21 times throughout the Old Testament. And interestingly enough, after this first use in Genesis 2:18, Ezer is commonly used to describe not women, but God. And what I think is even more interesting about this word is that it's often used in military context. That God is coming to be Israel's Ezer. He's coming to be their strength, to rescue them, to save them. If you were to look at the other passages that use this word, you're going to find this imagery of swords and shields and these military type concepts, that God is Israel's Ezer. So when you see this word applied to women, this isn't a title of inferiority or weakness. No, it's quite the opposite. Just as God is Israel's helper, Eve was Adam's helper. This isn't meaning that she is subject to him, just as God was not subject to Israel. No, this is a position, a title of strength. And I think it's interesting that God uses military terms to describe women, because we often place women on the sidelines, but God intended for women to be on the front lines. Far too often we have held women back from reaching their God potential because we haven't understood what this term helpmate means. And now I want to switch gears a little bit. Now that we've looked at what the definition, what the intended use of this word means, let's look at 4 truths that we can pull from Genesis 2:18 in this word helpmate. The first truth that we can pull from this verse is that men and women are equal but different. Genesis 2:18, in its use of the word Ezer Kenegdo, tell us that men and women are different. But that doesn't mean that one is better than the other. No, just as Eve complemented Adam, Adam complemented Eve. Each on their own, they were lacking something, but together they were whole. This word helpmate carries with it this idea of complementary, that they were made for each other, but it doesn't have anything to do with inferiority or superiority. Remember, God calls himself our helpmate. That doesn't mean that he's inferior to us. No, that would be ridiculous. And just as God's not inferior to us, women aren't inferior to man. This word means that women are different, but equal. And those differences should be celebrated. The second truth that we can pull from this passage is that Eve was to serve alongside Adam, not behind Adam. For much of human history, women have kind of been cast aside, pushed to the back, but that's not at all what God intended. That was not his original design. His original design was that Adam and Eve would serve together, side by side, not with Eve straggling behind or Adam having to pull her where he wanted to go. No, they were to serve side by side. The third truth that we can pull from this passage is that helpmate is a term of strength. Often when we hear this word, we think it's a term of inferiority or weakness, but remember, this is a term that God applies to himself. And often it's a term that's used in military context as a term of strength and salvation and saving and rescuing. This word helpmate is a term of strength. And if anything, when God calls Eve a helpmate, he's not pointing out a weakness in her, in women. He's pointing out a weakness in Adam, in man. Because he's the one that needed help. He's the one that needed rescue. He's the one that needed saving. You see, this term, helpmate, is a term of strength, not of weakness. The fourth truth that we can learn from this word in this passage is that as Eve was Adam's helper, God is our helper. Throughout the Old Testament, God continually applies this word helpmate to himself as he helps, as he rescues, as he saves his people. And this is a unique way that God has put his image into women. It's not a term of weakness. No, it's a term of strength. It's a way that they uniquely reflect the image of God. The Bible teaches us that men and women were created different, but equal. Both men and women reflect the image of God. Both men and women reflect his goodness. The differences don't make one better than the other, one superior to the other, one over the other. They're differences that should be celebrated. Our culture has the tendency to downplay differences in the name of equality because being equal means that you can do everything that the other person can do. But the Bible teaches us a different way, that differences should be celebrated, that God created us each uniquely. We each uniquely reflect who he is. We are each image bearers of him. One is not better than the other. It's just different. And our differences should be celebrated, but not elevated. You see, we often look at our differences and we say, well, I'm better than you because I'm different. But our differences shouldn't be elevated. They should just be celebrated, that together we can do more than we could separate. And that's what Genesis 2:18 is trying to communicate. Not that women are inferior, but rather that women reflect God's image uniquely. And that difference should be celebrated. Thanks for watching. I hope that you learned something and this helped you rethink parts of your life and your faith. If it did, would you share this video with a friend so that they too can learn? And then also subscribe to this channel and like this video so you can stay up to date on future videos that are coming out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.